And so if we have that sort of why, which is this venue for life idea, then how do we actually get into the design itself? Style and inspiration to me are very important things that, are part of every project. And for me, this aesthetic preference that I have is really about this, the word that I use is clean. Clean, classic, whatever you like. There are certain styles that just persist a little bit more when they just have that clean line, sort of classic style, compared to, more of a flash where, it might just not have the longevity compared to other things. And, when I look at inspiration, I often find it in movies. I've got directors and, visual effects people that I really like who, use lighting in interesting ways, combine lighting, geometry, and framing in interesting ways, and creating moods that are the backdrop for the movie or the film that's, going to be shot there. And again, though, the intent of what's going on. So, setting these things up, yes, they're interesting, but that's not the goal that's not where they're starting. They're starting with what are we trying to do here? And then creating a set that is creating that mood and the atmosphere through the architecture. And certainly there's other examples that are closer to the venues that I work on mostly, which are, these skate parks and these sort of colorful versions, ones that are integrated into building infrastructure more seamlessly, and certainly climbing facilities as well, which are just this next generation of these wild facilities that are being built all over the world. And so when we go to put these things together, we need to know, first of all, a theory about how these things will fit together, what the ingredients are, and then what the relationships are between them. So this is my favorite architecture theorist, or one of them, Sanford Quinter, and he talks about climbing in some of his lectures. One of the things he's really pointing out is the way that climbers are experiencing the same object at different scales. And so these are all images of Devil's Tower, where you've got the people on the left taking their photo from afar, the person in the middle free soloing, and then the image on the right of the actual grain of the rock itself. And this is how we interact with our climbing facilities as well. But in general, this is the way we interact with architecture. There are different scales of engagement, from looking at it on a drawing to being in the facility to actually climbing on the wall. These different degrees of interaction are unique for each of us as individual people. They're unique for us as climbers of different abilities, whatever the case is, but we're experiencing the same thing in different ways. And further, the idea of inclined surfaces is always something that is important in the way that architecture is defined, because moving across inclined surfaces, or in the world of climbing, maybe overhanging surfaces, is always something that has a lot of technical requirements in the world of architecture. So this is Opera House in Scandinavia. This is Yokohama Port Terminal in Japan. And some of the issues we start seeing in the world of architecture are issues about the flatness of materials. How do we break different surfaces down? How do we deal with landings and other circulation issues that are required? How do you add the handrails and things like that that are just needed for the building to operate? You can see the way the handrails have been designed so that they can actually adapt and sort of change their own geometry relative to the surface they're attaching to. You can see landings, every 30 feet or so. Whatever it is, there's actually a lot going on that is baked into the surfacing of the actual architecture that we're inhabiting and moving across. Two things that I think about when I'm looking at designing a building: On Growth and Form, and this book, Nudge. The book On Growth and Form, the big takeaway for me is that the word form, I think, often gets misconstrued for aesthetics, meaning, how it looks. Form is really about formation. How did something come to be? And on Growth and Form, they're talking a lot about actually mapping this, or using even math in certain cases to understand how things evolve over time as they grow, as they develop. And that's important because it's not that we need to be overly rigorous, but having an intent for why something ends up looking like it does, I think is an important thing. And additionally, the book Nudge is really talking about the idea that we can't be forcing people to do anything, but what we can do is set up conditions where they then are able to interact with a fixed object. So in this case, setting up conditions around the Seagram building in this plaza so that people can sit and move and enjoy it. And then the sort of rarity of when someone actually cuts across it, that becomes actually a sort of unique situation in itself. And we can start seeing that as people start to make things their own. So, when you're talking about like mapping paths, for instance, this is what people end up doing, which we can fight this with things like, ropes and whatever, but we also can observe them and try to set up situations where, in this case at Ohio State, they saw that people were sort of trampling all over the place. And so they ended up reverse engineering that and actually adjusting their own quad to follow more like these desire lines that were being put in by people, regardless of if they wanted to or not. And so this is all just the idea of nudging and providing solutions and ways for people to interact with a fixed object, a built environment, in a way that actually works for them and creates conditions that they understand without you having to be there to explain it. And so when we talk about putting things together, though, we do need ingredients. Like, what are we even making this building out of? And that has a lot to do with your business, what you want to do. This is not going to be standard. These are not standard things. It has to do with, what's the goal? What's the mix? What's the building? What city are we in? What's the context? What are you trying to do with it? Are you doing World Cup events? Are you doing, do you want to do more local events? Do you want to be setting things up with kitchens and bathrooms and, areas for kids? What kind of training are you going to be putting into it? All of this stuff continues to evolve. What type of features, symmetrical walls, lockers, amenities, other spaces like that, and workspaces and whatever it is. And the short version is that I don't know what you each want to include in your project. And the reason for that is because you're all individuals. You're going to have your own preferences, your own desires, your own business model. And so it's not about having a standard list of this is what you need. There are, of course, certain things that we're going to need in most facilities, but it's really about what are the bits and pieces that you want to include. Because from there, we then start talking about what it is that we're actually making. So fitness isn't fitness. They can be all variations of the same type of ingredient, just like in this image, which is showing that using different types of the same ingredient will have a big impact on the final result. So even once we decide what the goal is, the ingredients that we use to get there has a big impact on what the final thing is. And so again, fitness isn't fitness. And even within the certain ingredients we pick, so say we understand what we're trying to do, we pick a certain ingredient, the ratios that we use also matter. The ratios will have an effect on the final result. And then further, the techniques that we use also make a difference. So at every step along the way that we actually put things together, the type of ingredients we use, the way that we use different ratios, these things all actually have a huge impact on the final result. Because it would be ridiculous to just put the ingredients in and not mix them together. That isn't how we do this. We end up mixing them. And the reason we do that is because that's how we actually can get more out of it. It's not A plus B and C is equaling whatever. It's trying to get more by looking for possibilities between these things, between these different components, because of our intent. And that's how we're trying to get more out of it than just what they would be alone. And so when it comes to actually putting them together, ironically, a lot of it has to do with the space between them more than the actual ingredients themselves. And so this is an example of a project in Japan where it's a museum and it's this circular plan where these boxes have been put in place that are able to be grouped in different ways depending on what type of gallery situation is being desired, what type of event is going on. And so it's a fixed framework that allows for multiple different uses. So different entrances, because it's this circular plan. These cubes allow for different variation as people use it in different ways, different users, different events, whatever it is. And that's, again, very much what we're doing here when we take a sketch like this, which is about the relationship between these things. It's not just putting all of these things on a spreadsheet. It might start there, but it's about figuring out how these things relate to each other. You know, what are the visual connections, whatever it is. Developing that further, developing it even further, visualizing it, understanding it, testing it, working fast and lean, and eventually, after a whole lot more time, getting to something like this, where it's a background for our lives to be, you know, these venues where our work and our play can take place. A very specific case study related to this. This is the original Brooklyn Boulders Somerville, which is now a bouldering project. 2010, this is probably the first time I was in the space at all. Big concrete warehouse, concrete floor warehouse. And this is where we started, and very quickly we started iterating three-dimensional models to try to figure out what the different components would be, how they would relate to each other. And, you know, pretty quickly these things evolve, and you can see even over time how these different bits and pieces, some stay, some grow, some evolve. And there were many times where I would be standing in this space, you know, looking at this, showing an image like this, connecting the dots between what was being built and what the final facility was actually going to be. And the final facility, you know, embodies a whole lot of other ideas that are not necessarily drawn on the plans. And along the way, there's this whole, you know, process of getting there, which can be, you know, certainly a very tricky one. But when we're actually laying out the space, a lot of times I'm looking at the pathways that are navigating through the space as much as anything else. I've always thought of these things as eddies, as ways to collect people in different parts of the building. And so when we start looking at an actual drawing of the Somerville project, so getting really into the details here, the way that this generally works is to block out certain areas that are more fixed, meaning, you know, a lot of times it's mechanical, electrical, plumbing stuff that doesn't want to be moving, bathrooms, elevators, whatever. And those objects are these sort of rocks that are creating eddies where different people are allowed to collect in different areas. And so in this particular case, you've got areas where people are able to, you know, go for sort of beginner and, you know, events and parties where they can have access to event rooms and a sort of event wall right there that's a little bit out of the way. If you're more in front of the main boulder, that's where you've got people looking at you from the second floor, people looking at you from the ground floor. You're really on display there compared to some of these more sort of secondary areas that are a little bit more tucked away. And that's all because, you know, everybody's different. Everybody's going to have different preferences. And so when we start overlaying the lines of sight, you know, one of the main ones in this facility was the fact that you can actually see all the way through the entire facility from one end to another. And again, that's not an accident. You know, that's something that we thought was very striking about this, you know, 300-foot long space. So having these axes about how do you enter the space, how do you have views through it, what relates to other parts, you know, how are you being able to work through the entire facility? And as you move up to the second floor or the mezzanine, it is even more, where you've got these different viewing platforms. You know, you've got this sort of a catwalk that has a view of that sort of beginner or kids area, you know, where the treadmills are. You've got this great view of the whole space. You know, one of my favorite spots is on the mezzanine, where you can see across the entire facility to this big window on the ground floor that we put in to really connect that visually. And so, you know, across both of the levels, that's really what's going on. And as you start moving through the facility, you end up having circuits that we really do think about during the design process, where you don't have to double back on places that you've already been. You can sort of navigate through this thing in whatever way suits you, whether you're an employee doing a tour or a user who comes into the facility to use it every few days. It really is about exploration. And so we're setting up the conditions for that exploration. And furthermore, when we put in the mezzanine and we raise this roof here, the height that we put the mezzanine at immediately allows you to have a few different things happening. So you've got one height, you've got a full height, you've got the existing height, and then you've got this other height that is the ceiling to the new mezzanine. So right there, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 different heights of climbing walls that are being put into the space just by the way that we did two things, meaning we added this roof and then we added this mezzanine. And so these relationships, it's not just the plan, it's the section, it's about how it all relates to each other. And these fixed objects, in this case, the height of the mezzanine and the location of the mezzanine, are the few moves that we use to trigger all of these other things and all these other dynamics across the facility. And so a lot of that is showing up in these very, very early models and as you move forward, because these fixed objects that we put in place, that's where the exploration happens between them. So we're setting this situation up for people to sort of explore the space in between and the relationship between things. And so when you look at a picture like this is that sort of showpiece bouldering wall where you can see the way that the mezzanine is naturally tiered to allow for seating. There's even room for seating down in front where those two people are. And when you look back up, you can see the shorter bouldering wall that is, we dialed in the height of the mezzanine to allow for that. You can see the windows that are up there and the new roof that actually give you a view of downtown Boston when you're at the top of the wall. And the sort of amphitheaters that are set up within the facility that when they're not doing a presentation, you might not even know are there. But when you look at it this way, it becomes a lot more clear that this is what's going on. And you can see in the very far distance that window that I was talking about. And certainly this project has gotten a good degree of credit and sort of interest from people not only within the climbing world but also outside of it in the workspace. And that was one of the big things, was the introduction of coworking into this space.